On the national stage, the New Democratic Party has ended the supply and confidence deal with the Liberals, ending the agreement that has helped keep Justin Trudeau the Prime Minister and given the NDP some legislative wins they otherwise might not have had. This obviously brings the prospects of a federal election into the nearer future. Premier Doug Ford, however, he has other ideas.
Yes, at a news conference on Monday, Doug Ford said he believed that Jagmeet Singh wouldn't trigger an election until after a very specific date. Let's take a listen.
There's nothing more important to these greedy politicians than collecting a pension. And he was elected in October 2019, and October 19th, 2019. And I'll be floored, and I'll stand up here and apologize to all the greedy politicians if he calls the election early.
The Premier got the date wrong, actually, when he said the pensions kick in as of such and such a date. He corrected himself at another news conference on Wednesday of this week, because I think the record shows Singh was first elected as the MP in Burnaby South in British Columbia in February 2019, prior to the fall 2019 election. It was a by-election. Mr. Singh's pension eligibility, therefore, would actually kick in sooner than it would for other MPs who were elected that year. The question then becomes, how big a factor is pension eligibility when opposition politicians start to think about when they want to pull the plug on the federal Liberals? What do you think?
I don't think that Singh personally is terribly worried about being re-elected in Burnaby South, right? That would be the issue for him personally. But he does have a caucus to answer to, right? So maybe it will be a factor in his decision. But, trying to force an election is such a big move. There's never just one factor to consider. And I would expect that in this case, it would be a relatively small one. We should also note that the NDP actually doesn't have the numbers to force an election if they choose to vote no confidence in the government. They have to get the Bloc Québécois to agree with them, which puts Prime Minister Trudeau in a bit of a nicer spot, a bit more comfortable spot, because he has more negotiating partners.
Now, as you might imagine, Jagmeet Singh, when he heard what Doug Ford had to say about him, decided that he wanted to make a few comments too, so why don't we play what he had to say next? Absolutely. Sheldon, if you would.
I think Doug Ford needs to worry about delivering health care for people in Canada instead of being obsessed with alcohol. People in Ontario can't get the health care they need. They're struggling with the cost of living, and he's obsessed with alcohol and convenience stores. I don't know any person that I've spoken to when I tour Ontario, when I'm in the communities, that say that that's their number one pressing issue.
Shots fired, I believe the kids say. I think it's also fair to remind our listeners that while city councillors, mayors, and MPs, federal MPs, all have pensions, provincial MPPs do not.
Correct.
In Ontario. Doug Ford will not get a pension from his time as Premier, nor will any current MPP. We've talked before about how that shapes the choices of provincial politicians, but we have a clear case at hand, right? Todd Smith has said that one of the reasons for his retirement and seeking private sector employment and thereby causing this by-election in Bay of Quinte is because he's at the point in his life where he needs to think about retirement security, and MPPs don't have pensions.
It is amazing how many people think Ontario legislators have gold-plated pensions like the federal members do. We should remind everybody that it was Premier Mike Harris in the 1990s who got rid of the pension. It's been almost 30 years since MPPs did not have pensions at Queen's Park. So for all of those of you who think these greedy buggers, they're only after their pensions, they don't have pensions, and they haven't for almost 30 years. Now, I know we're all skeptical about politics. That is just the nature of the beast. And none of us can imagine that MPs would risk not being eligible for their pensions, and therefore they will allow the Trudeau government to remain in place because, of course, they want it to stay there long enough for them to be eligible for their pensions. However, this is where I need to remind everybody that that was exactly the kind of thinking that took place back in 1979, and I remember this well. The Conservatives were in power. They had a minority government in the federal parliament. They were convinced that the opposition Liberals would never jeopardize their pensions by defeating Joe Clark's government, because many people at that stage were not yet eligible for pensions. But the Liberals did. They did pull the plug on Joe Clark. They did force an election. They ran the risk of not getting pensions if Clark came back with a majority, for example. The current Prime Minister's father came out of retirement. He'd already stepped down. He came out of retirement to lead the Liberals to a majority government in 1980 in the next election. So it did work out well for those Liberal opposition members. I guess the lesson here is don't be so sure about what you think you know about people's motives, because you never know.